Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
And today, we are taking on a source that, despite being pretty short, has had this profound influence on how we talk about modern life. It's Mark Fisher's foundational text, Capitalist Realism. Is there no alternative?
Okay, let's unpack this right away. I mean, we've all felt it, right? That intense, grinding stress of late capitalism, the constant pressure, this pervasive anxiety that, everything could just fall apart tomorrow. But Fisher's central puzzle isn't really about whether the unemployment rate is up or down or what the inflation target should be.
No, it's much deeper. His core question is really about perception.
Exactly. Why does capitalism feel so inevitable, so natural and permanent, like gravity or the seasons changing?
Right. It's that feeling that the system is simply reality itself. And this feeling persists even when the result, you see it everywhere. Rising rates of mental distress, environmental destruction, massive inequality.
Even when these things are actively harming us.
Actively harming us. The harms are completely visible, yet the system itself just remains, well, unquestionable.
So this deep dive, it's fundamentally not about a specific policy or, debating market mechanics. We're not favoring one political side over another.
Not at all.
We're here to examine the belief system itself. That widespread, internalized sense captured by Margaret Thatcher's famous acronym, TMA.
There is no alternative.
And Fisher is arguing that this isn't just some successful political slogan. It's a kind of cultural unconscious. It structures what we can even imagine is possible.
Precisely. So our mission today is a systems-level analysis. We're looking at how these belief structures actually function and how a certain framework becomes what we just accept as common sense.
How it sort of automatically occupies the entire horizon of the thinkable.
Yeah. And we're maintaining a strictly impartial, non-ideological stance here. We're just trying to analyze the material to understand the deep, subtle mechanisms this system of perception uses to maintain its own stability, its own ubiquity.
To really get the power of this concept, I think we need to know the architect behind it.
Right. Mark Fisher.
He was a really significant cultural theorist, a critic, a prolific writer who became hugely influential, especially through his weblog, K-Punk.
And his work at Goldsmiths, University of London. That background gave him a really unique vantage point. His work was appearing in publications like Frieze, New Statesman, The Wire.
So he was someone deeply embedded in analyzing culture.
Totally. Music, film, art, theory. And he was always connecting it back to the underlying political and economic structures. He saw the links.
The book itself, published in 2009, it lands in this really unique and profoundly telling historical moment.
It really does. The sources kind of point to two major bookends for this period. First, you have the post-Cold War triumphalism.
Right, the Fukuyama end of history idea.
Exactly. The sense that liberal capitalism had won the great ideological battle, and that was it. The 90s were just filled with a sense of finality that all serious structural alternatives had just been exhausted.
And then, dramatically contradicting that whole narrative comes the second bookend.
The 2008 banking crisis. A massive visible rupture in that story.
That crisis was so crucial, wasn't it? Because it just exposed the lie of neoliberalism's official promise, this idea of the withering away of the state.
The theory was that the market would be sovereign and government should shrink down to almost nothing.
But that is not what we saw.
Not at all. What we actually saw was the state, the very thing they'd spent decades trying to dismantle, rushing in with extraordinary speed and trillions of dollars to shore up the banking system.
It proved pretty spectacularly that even the most supposedly autonomous market still relies on massive state power to maintain itself.
Especially when the wealthy elites are threatened. The ideology at TINA was maintained, but the functional mechanisms used to save it were purely governmental.
And if we look even earlier, for the symbolic origins of this TINA doctrine, especially in the UK where Fisher was writing, the sources point to one foundational, really brutal defeat.
The UK miners' strike of 84-85.
That's the one.
That event is highlighted as a key moment in establishing capitalist realism. The closure of the pits, which was devastating to entire communities, was defended precisely on the grounds that keeping them open was just not economically realistic. The costs were too high.
And what's so interesting is how the miners were cast in that moment. It wasn't just as political opponents.
No, it was almost as cultural relics. They were portrayed as the last actors in some doomed proletarian romance, hopelessly clinging to an outdated social system.
So it was a victory for an idea.
A decisive one, the idea that economic realism, which really means the short-term profit metrics of the current system, trumps all other social, communal, or historical considerations. It established realism as the ultimate political criterion.
And what I find fascinating is that Fisher then consciously chooses to move beyond a traditional economic critique. He focuses so heavily on psychology, culture, mental health. Why that shift? If the system is unjust, why not just focus on wages and taxes?
That's a crucial question. Fisher's argument is that the failures and dysfunctions of the system are systematically displaced onto the individual.
So if the system fails to provide stability or meaning?
The response is internalized. Mental health issues, he says, aren't just some economic side effect. They are absolutely central to understanding the dysfunction of contemporary capitalism.
So if you feel stressed, anxious, depressed, the system sort of encourages you to think. You failed to adapt, your brain chemistry is off, you need better coping strategies.
Or maybe a pill. The structural causes just vanish from the picture.
Right.
If we're constantly told there's no alternative, then any dissatisfaction you feel can only be a personal pathology, a failure of the self. Fisher sees this epidemic of anxiety and depression, especially among young people, not as individual weaknesses, but as the inevitable emotional cost of living under this totalizing, non-negotiable pressure.
Which brings us to the central thesis in plain language. If you take away just one concept from this deep dive, it has to be this one: capitalist realism.
It's the pervasive understanding that capitalism is not a political or economic system you might choose to support or oppose. It is now experienced as reality itself.
The air we breathe.
The water we swim in. It seamlessly occupies the entire horizon of the thinkable for a whole generation. It's so ingrained that, for most people under 20 in Europe and North America, the lack of alternatives isn't even an issue anymore. It's just assumed, like the continued existence of time.
That structural assumption leads us straight to this pretty chilling idea about the limits of our imagination. We often hear that phrase attributed to Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek.
It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Exactly.
And that phrase just captures the atmosphere perfectly. Why? Because capitalist realism has successfully colonized the future. I mean, once utopian or even dystopian stories were exercises in imagination, they'd posit some disaster that led to a fundamentally different way of living.
But Fisher argues that the dystopia of capitalist realism is different.
It's different because it's not an alternative future. It's just an intensification of the present.
And he uses Alfonso Cuarón's 2006 film Children of Men as the key example of this new kind of catastrophe being internalized.
Yeah, Children of Men is so unique because it resists those familiar totalitarian scenarios. The world is sterile, it's collapsing, it's filled with despair, and yet, and this is the crucial part, the political structures managing the slow collapse coexist seamlessly with all the familiar signs of late capitalism.
The ultra-authoritarian measures, like internment camps.
Run right alongside franchise coffee bars and banal corporate logos?
It's not a revolution or a nuclear winter, it's just decay.
It's just decay. Exactly. The world doesn't end with a bang, it unravels gradually. The catastrophe is, as Fisher says, being lived through. It's the normal backdrop of everyday life. And the film's central idea, mass sterility, no children being born, Fisher reads that metaphorically.
As the ultimate cultural impasse.
Right. How can a culture persist without the new? If the future only holds reiteration and repermutation of old ideas, we're left in this condition of culture as a museum.
This is a really important point about how this system limits imagination. It just subsumes and consumes all previous history, all previous culture, and turns it into a commodity.
Everything gets assigned a monetary value through this system of equivalence, regardless of its original context. Religious iconography, pornography, even Karl Marx's Das Kapital itself, ironically.
It's all just available for purchase.
Or consumption. If you walk through a major art museum, you see this so acutely. You see sacred objects or politically potent objects just torn from their original purpose and put on display as high-value artifacts.
They're stripped of their functional power.
Completely. The sources use the fate of Picasso's Guernica in the film as the perfect detail. That painting was a howl of anguish and outrage against fascist atrocities. In the film, it's just a preserved wall hanging in some wealthy government building.
A heritage artifact.
accorded iconic status only once it's totally deprived of any political or practical function. A culture that is merely preserved, he says, is no culture at all.
Okay, so if that's what happens to belief and political engagement, where does the system push us psychologically? Fisher says it shifts us from genuine belief to spectatorship.
Correct. We move to spectatorship and aesthetics. The system argues, implicitly, that genuine engagement is dangerous, that it leads to fatal abstractions and fanaticism.
So the system presents itself as the protector from the perils of belief itself.
And irony becomes the ultimate defense mechanism.
The attitude of ironic distance.
It's the proper psychological state for postmodern capitalism. It's supposed to immunize us against ideological seductions. This cynicism allows us to feel superior to the system while we're actively participating in it.
So it's like the perspective of a depressive.
Fisher makes that exact comparison. He likens it to the deflationary perspective of a depressive who believes any positive state, any hope, is just a dangerous illusion. It's the position that says, I'm too smart, too knowing, too sophisticated to believe in change.
But the irony is that the system has gotten so good at consuming everything that even subversion is sort of accounted for in advance. He calls it pre-corporation.
Exactly. Subversive potentials are pre-corporated. They're formatted in advance by capitalist culture. Anything labeled alternative or independent isn't actually outside the mainstream anymore.
They're just dominant, readily packaged styles within it.
Right. If you create anti-capitalist art, it's immediately ready for a gallery sale and a museum display.
Nothing embodies this deadlock better than Kurt Cobain and Nirvana.
Yeah, Cobain's struggle was that impasse. He was paralyzed by the knowledge that every protest move he made was a cliché scripted in advance. He knew intimately that nothing runs better on MTV than a protest against MTV.
His anxiety was real, but he found himself in a world where genuine innovation seemed impossible.
It did. And his death in this reading becomes this tragic confirmation of the defeat of rock's utopian ambitions. It signified the exhaustion of the idea that music could fundamentally alter the social structure.
And what followed was
Pastiche rock. It just reproduced the forms of the past without that underlying existential tension or the ambition for cultural transformation.
we see a similar shift in genres like hip-hop, moving toward what Fisher calls a neo-noir worldview.
Simon Reynolds pointed out this dual meaning of real in hip-hop. First, it's authentic, uncompromised music. But second, it's music that reflects the reality of late capitalism, economic instability, institutionalized racism, surveillance.
So gangster rap, like neo-noir writers like James Ellroy, embraces a reality that's stripped of all illusions.
A Hobbesian, demythologized war of all against all.
Ellroy's insistence on cruelty and savagery becomes almost a performance, but it serves a function for capitalist realism by normalizing brutality.
It absolutely reinforces the status quo. Mike Davis hypothesized that the noir genre's role might have been to endorse the emergence of Homo erogenus.
Yeah.
It's this kind of machismo of demythologization, where constant corruption ceases to outrage or even interest you.
It just confirms the reality that it's dog eat dog.
And that expecting anything more is naive.
And here's where it gets really, I think, really interesting.
Yeah.
The system is so effective that it even includes anti-capitalism as a functional reinforcing loop.
Yes.
It sells us the idea that it's evil, and we buy it.
This is the triumphs of cynicism, as Zizek could say. I mean, anti-capitalism is everywhere. The evil corporation is a standard Hollywood villain. But far from undermining capitalist realism, this gestural anti-capitalism reinforces it through a concept called interpassivity.
Okay. Could you define interpassivity for us?
So interpassivity, a term from Robert Fowler, means that the object, the cultural product, performs our critical attitude for us. It thinks, it feels, it criticizes, so we don't have to. We outsource the hard work of resistance.
Which makes Disney Pixar's WALL-E the perfect, ironic example.
It's a gorgeous film, but it savagely satirizes consumerism and corporate greed. Earth is despoiled by this mega-corporation, by and large. But, as Fowler argues, the film does our anti-capitalism for us. We watch it, we feel appropriately critical of consumerism.
And then, feeling ethically satisfied, we just continue consuming with impunity.
Exactly. The film takes on the task, so we are psychologically freed from having to act on our own critique.
So the core ideology isn't sincere belief in capitalism. It's cynicism and disavowal. We know it's bad, but we act as if it's necessary.
Zizek argues that the fundamental level of ideology isn't an illusion masking reality. It's an unconscious fantasy that structures social reality itself. Cynical distance is how we blind ourselves to this structural power.
So as long as we believe in our hearts that capitalism is bad.
We're free to keep participating. We can fetishize money in our actions only because we've already taken an ironic distance toward it in our heads.
This plays out politically with events like Live 8, where the response to poverty became a consumer choice, not a political challenge.
Live Aid was that strange kind of protest that everyone could agree with. I mean, who wants poverty? It was all about ethical immediacy, insisting that caring individuals and celebrities could end famine directly without ever challenging the systemic structures that caused the inequalities in the first place.
Bono's Product Red is the ultimate symbol of this.
Absolutely. Product Red, which called itself punk rock hip-hop, openly accepted capitalism as the only game in town. The fantasy is that Western consumerism, far from being the problem, could itself be the solution.
Just buy the right ethically branded product.
And the problem of poverty gets reduced to a lack of individual generosity, not a structural feature of globalized capital.
And if we don't buy the right product, or if we express dissatisfaction, the system is designed to privatize that stress.
This is maybe the most urgent point Fisher makes. He draws on Oliver James's research in The Selfish Capitalist, which shows this direct link between rising rates of mental distress and the neoliberal mode of capitalism.
Especially in places like the UK, the USA, and Australia.
James documented a significant rise in anxiety and psychiatric problems between the late 70s and late 80s, the exact period that saw the full implementation of neoliberal policies.
That seems like a massive claim. Why does Fisher insist we have to reframe this as a social crisis, not an individual health crisis?
Because instead of urging individuals to just resolve their own psychological distress, we have to ask, how has it become acceptable that so many people, especially young people, are ill? The sources insist that the mental health plague is the clearest sign that, far from being the only system that works, capitalism is inherently dysfunctional.
The stress isn't a bug, it's a feature.
It's a feature. The system externalizes its own fragility as psychological pressure onto its subjects.
And this crisis is reflected in the shift in how we work, away from that rigid, predictable Fordist factory model.
Right, we've moved from Foucault's disciplinary societies, organized around enclosed spaces like the factory or the school, to Deleuze control societies.
And in control societies.
All institutions are embedded in a kind of dispersed corporation. Control is constant, it's distributed, and it's internalized, rather than being centralized in a few places.
Michael Mann's film Heat is used to illustrate this new post-Fordist ethos, where rootlessness becomes a professional virtue.
Yeah, you compare the cold professionalism of Neil Macaulay's crew in Heat to the fixed loyalty of the Cosa Nostra in The Godfather. Macaulay's credo is that famous line, "Don't let yourself get attached to anything you are not willing to walk out on in 30 seconds flat."
That ethos of interchangeability, flexibility.
It's the exact opposite of traditional family or communal loyalty. Post-Fordist arrangements are temporary, pragmatic, and lateral.
And the sociologist Richard Sennett documents the personal cost of this in The Corrosion of Character.
Sennett focuses on this new condition of no long-term commitment. Workers have to periodically re-skill. The premium is on flexibility and adaptability.
Yeah.
And this puts this intolerable stress on traditional family values like obligation and trustworthiness, which are suddenly seen as obsolete in the workplace.
But the family is needed more than ever as a place of respite, a real contradiction.
A profound one.
What's really fascinating is that the sources even cite a specific date for this huge systemic switch from discipline to control.
The Marxist economist Christian Marazzi pinpoints October 6, 1979.
Wow.
That's when the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker hiked interest rates dramatically, and that paved the way for the deregulation and casualization of the precarity that would define post-Fordism.
That seems almost impossibly specific for such a massive economic shift. Why a monetary move and not, say, the rise of the PC?
Because that interest rate hike was the mechanism that broke the power of organized labor and allowed capital to demand this new flexibility. It signaled that the system was prioritizing monetary stability and corporate needs over worker stability and long-term contracts.
It created the financial conditions for deregulation to flourish.
And for the old class conflict, which was external labor versus capital, to become internalized.
How so internalized?
The antagonism is now located inside the psychology of the worker. A worker might support old-style class conflict, but as someone relying on a pension fund, they're also interested in maximizing investment yields. This psychological conflict creates casualties. Marazzi is researching the link between the increase in bipolar disorder and post-Fordism, arguing it mirrors the ceaseless boom and bust cycles of modern capital. If we shift now to systems mapping, we really have to grasp capital not as a human institution, but as this impersonal, automatic structure that operates independently of human intention.
Fisher goes back to Deleuze and Guattari here, describing capital as the unnameable thing.
It's an infinitely plastic entity, capable of metabolizing and absorbing anything and converting it into its own form. It dismantles old social codes only to reinstall them ad hoc for its own profit. Fisher's most accurate description is almost Gothic. He calls it an abstract parasite, an insatiable vampire and zombie maker.
But the living flesh it converts into dead labor is ours.
And the zombies it makes are us, our time, our attention, our vitality.
Neoliberalism was supposed to get rid of bureaucracy, yet Fisher argues it has just changed form and proliferated into what he calls market Stalinism.
The persistence of bureaucracy isn't an anomaly. It shows how capitalism actually works, which is very different from the idealized picture. We've seen a massive proliferation of new bureaucracy, the obsession with aims, objectives, mission statements, audits.
It's a fusion of market imperatives with centralized targets.
And Fisher drew heavily on his experience in further education colleges as the ideal trial ground for these so-called reforms.
Why?
Because colleges were subjected to market pressures and government targets really early on. They became a laboratory for structural changes that were then rolled out across public services like the NHS or local government. Resources became explicitly tied to quantifying outcomes like achievement, attendance, retention.
But how does that lead to market Stalinism?
The core issue is that the drive to measure things that are resistant to quantification, like the actual process of teaching or learning, leads to market Stalinism. The system ends up valuing the symbol of achievement over the actual achievement.
So the goal isn't to educate, but to meet the target for successful completions.
Exactly.
This reminds me so much of that bit from the film Office Space about the flair requirement. It just perfectly illustrates this metric-driven absurdity.
That's a perfect microcosm. The demand for workers to express individuality by wearing 7 pieces of flair is a metaphor for post-Fordist emotional labor. But the critical point is the hidden expectation behind the official standard.
Right. The waitress who wore exactly 7 pieces was asked if she wanted to look like someone who only does the bare minimum.
So even meeting the official target is not enough. You have to constantly exceed it, but without a clear definition of what exceeding it even means. The satisfactory grade is no longer satisfactory.
It drives this constant demoralizing self-improvement and compliance. It creates a perpetual state of inadequacy.
Workers are forced to internally police themselves, always fearing they haven't adequately performed the appearance of enthusiasm.
And what comes out of all this intense quantification is that work becomes geared toward representation rather than actual productivity.
The effort is channeled into generating and massaging audited representations. PR production. An anthropological study Fisher cites found that local authorities spent far more time and resources on representing their services correctly to auditors than on actually improving the services themselves.
So the system is prioritizing the symbol of development over the functional reality.
That is the essence of market Stalinism. The sources make a direct parallel to Marshall Berman's description of Stalin's White Sea Canal project. The symbol of development building the canal to impress tourists was prioritized over the reality that the canal was too shallow for actual commerce.
In late capitalism, all that is solid melts into PR.
And value on the stock exchange depends more on perceptions and beliefs about future performance than tangible output.
To understand why this PR production works, we need to bring in Eshek's Lacanian concept of the big other. Now, this is a very theoretical idea, so let's try to break it down.
The big other is essentially the collective fiction. It's the virtual figure or symbolic structure we need to believe in, even when no single individual actually believes. It's the assumed audience, the consumer of PR, who is deemed not to know reality.
So everyone knows the product is flimsy, but we all pretend that someone believes the advertising. That someone is the big other.
Exactly. And the system collapses when that illusion of shared consensus is broken, when the fiction is exposed publicly and undeniably.
Which brings us to the perfect, if painful, example. The Ratner's jewelry fiasco.
When Gerald Ratner, the CEO of the UK jewelry chain, publicly called the jewelry shop full crap, he forced the big other to acknowledge the ugly reality that everyone already knew privately. The consequence was immediate and severe.
$500 million was wiped off the company's value almost overnight.
Just because the official consensus, the required collective fiction, was broken.
And this whole structure of market Stalinism and cynical disavowal works because it it denies social causation and privatizes distress.
The current ruling ontology, or belief system, insists that mental illness is an individual chemico-biological problem, often just explained away by low serotonin levels.
This chemical biologization.
It rules out social or political explanations, and
Right.
it has enormous benefits for capitalism.
What are those benefits? It serves a dual purpose, right?
First, it reinforces this atomistic individualization.
Yeah.
You are sick because of your brain chemistry, not because of your precarious job. And second, it provides a massive lucrative market for pharmaceuticals, which are ready to treat the chemical imbalance that's supposedly the root cause.
It also perfectly individualizes failure, linking back to the whole neoliberal dream.
Absolutely. Neoliberal capitalism systematically encourages the delusion that anyone can be Bill Gates.
Yeah.
So the system says, if you fail, there is only one person to blame.
Yourself.
Yourself. Your failure is a purely personal, ethical, or biological flaw.
And this deflection of blame is visible even when massive structural failures occur, like the Tewksbury floods in 2007.
In the wake of those floods, which were caused by extensive building on floodplains and failures of privatized water infrastructure, the victims overwhelmingly blamed the government and the council.
For not stopping the builders.
Right. Rather than blaming the privatized water companies, the insurers, or the market forces that drove the building in the first place.
That's fascinating. Why deflect it onto the government, which had largely sidelined itself?
Fisher argues this is an act of deflection that comes from bad faith, a refusal to accept the consequences of the sidelining of government in global capitalism. People still long for the nanny state to blame, precisely for its failure to act as a centralized power.
It's unconscious disavowal. We know the government isn't pulling the strings, but nevertheless, we demand they fix the consequences of market failures.
The centerlessness of global capitalism is just radically unthinkable. People are told the market is sovereign, but they can't help but think of themselves as citizens searching for a centralized authority to restore order. The political mind hasn't caught up with the economic reality.
Okay, let's connect these dense structural concepts to modern lived experience, starting with a concept Fisher calls depressive hedonia. This feels like a key psychological pathology of our time.
It really is. Depressive hedonia is a state that goes beyond traditional depression, which is characterized by anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure.
Depressive hedonia is the inability to do anything except pursue pleasure.
Yes, it's that feeling of knowing that the constant pursuit of sugary, quick gratification is hollow, yet being utterly incapable of breaking away from that cycle of stimulus.
So it's not just sadness, it's an internal contradiction. You're constantly chasing pleasure scrolling, snacking, texting, but there's this persistent underlying sense that something is missing.
Exactly. And there is no appreciation that this mysterious missing enjoyment can only be accessed beyond the pleasure principle, through difficulty or delayed gratification. Because the consumer machine promises instant satisfaction, the pursuit of anything slow or effortful feels pointless.
This shows up clearly in the classroom reality Fisher describes, especially with attention spans.
Fisher mentions this anecdote of A-level students protesting that reading more than a couple of sentences is boring. Boredom, in this context, just means being removed from the constant communicative sensation stimulus matrix texting, YouTube, fast food.
To be denied that constant flow of sugary gratification is experienced as intolerable, a kind of sensory deprivation.
And this state is structurally linked to a fragmented sense of time.
Fragmented temporality.
Jameson's analysis is key here. The breakdown of the signifying chain reduces the subject to a series of pure and unrelated presence in time. We're dealing with a generation born into this ahistorical, anti-mnemonic blip culture where time has always been cut into digital microslices.
And if your experience is just a series of unrelated presents, the ability to connect present action to future consequences just breaks down.
Which is why the students can't connect their current lack of focus with future failure, like failing exams. The system has disabled the long-term memory required to build a coherent narrative of self. Everything is immediate, disposable, interchangeable.
And this environment then generates specific new pathologies, which are then medicalized.
ADHD is presented as a pathology of late capitalism, a consequence of being wired into a hyper-mediated, constantly interruptive consumer culture. The very structure of our devices encourages distraction, and then we diagnose the resulting behavior as a chemical brain disorder.
You also raise the concept of post-lexia here.
Right. What's often called dyslexia in teenagers may in many cases actually be postlexia, a subject who processes image-dense, fast-moving data very effectively, but without needing to read complex sequential text.
So slogan recognition and visual cues are enough to navigate the informational plane.
They're sufficient. Reading long-form text becomes not a developmental failure, but a functional obsolescence in a culture that privileges image and speed.
Deleuze and Guattari argued that capitalism is profoundly illiterate.
The electric language of data processing and algorithms does without the voice or writing. The emphasis shifts from understanding complex arguments to recognizing signs and rapidly processing stimuli. It's the consequence of capital converting everything into abstract data flows.
If the psychological cost is this constant anxiety and fragmentation, the most direct encounter with the centerlessness of capital happens in a very specific, dreaded environment: the call center.
The call center experience just perfectly distills the political phenomenology of late capitalism. As a consumer, you exist in two realities: the one where services work smoothly, and then the other one.
The crazed Kafkaesque labyrinth.
A labyrinth of automated systems and under-equipped operatives, a world without memory, where cause and effect are totally unfathomable.
And the anger and frustration you feel there is utterly impotent.
Your rage has to remain impotent because it has no legitimate object. You're forced to direct it at a fellow victim of the system, the low-paid, powerless operative. But there's no possibility of solidarity. You're confronting the artificial stupidity of capital itself.
Fisher uses Kafka's The Castle as an analogy to illustrate this.
Kay's experience with the telephone system in the castle, where there's no central exchange, the instruments are left off, messages are practical jokes, it uncannily predicts the modern call center.
You can't stop searching for the missing center.
The person who knows, the authority who can fix things. Even when the system confirms that no one knows and no one can do anything, the central authority is missing, yet we can't stop positing that it exists.
This realization breeds a kind of political disengagement, which Fisher saw in British students as reflexive impotence.
They know things are bad. They can articulate the problems of climate change, inequality, housing shortages, but more than that, they know they can't do anything about it.
So it's not passive apathy.
No, it's a structural learned helplessness, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their critique is sharp, but their conviction that action is futile is total.
This reflexive impotence contrasts with other forms of political activity, which Fisher categorized into two types: the immobilizers versus the liberal communists.
The immobilizers, like the French students who protested against pension changes, were effectively acting conservatively. They retained the form of 1968-style protest, but their goal was to keep the stability of the past. They were protesting against the flexibility and insecurity demanded by the system.
The liberal communists, people like Soros and Gates, they represent the ideological opposite, but their approach also limits possibility.
The liberal communists wholeheartedly embrace flexibility, nomadism, and spontaneity, the very hallmarks of post-Fordist management. Ejek argues this is the dominant ideology of capitalism now.
So they perform social responsibility while accelerating the underlying engine of capital.
And you're left in a political trap. If you resist flexibility, you sound like you're calling for old, stodgy ideas like centralization. If you embrace flexibility, you're just doing the system's work for it. It defeats any genuine alternative before it starts.
So the truly radical act is to step outside that loop
And demand a collective, structured alternative that subordinates the market, which is the one thing that's always viewed as unrealistic.
Yeah.
If we situate Fisher's analysis within the broader crisis and perception themes, he really powerfully reinforces that power doesn't operate through overt command. It hides in what seems like common sense.
And this is where that distinction between Lacan's the real and reality becomes so critical to understanding how systems maintain themselves.
Right. Reality is the consensus, the tissue of inconsistencies we accept to function day to day. The real is the traumatic void, the systemic contradictions, the imminent disasters that reality must suppress.
Capitalist realism presents its reality as natural and necessary.
So emancipatory politics must reveal what's presented as necessary, like the privatizations of the 1980s, to be a mere contingency that was once unthinkable.
And environmental catastrophe is maybe the ultimate example of the real breaking through the surface. It's a trauma too big to ignore.
But too big to be solved by the system itself. The environmental crisis fundamentally contradicts capital's growth fetish. Capitalism is inherently opposed to sustainability because it demands perpetual growth and externalization of costs.
Yet the crisis isn't repressed. It's immediately incorporated into marketing.
Rebranded. Reframed as a problem solvable by the market, green energy stocks, carbon offsets, ethical consumption.
The fantasy remains, just like in Wall-E, that capital can just keep going, that problems are temporary glitches, and that the market will find a technological fix that lets us keep consuming.
Which leads directly back to the responsibility trap, pushing the imperative to solve these systemic problems onto the individual consumer.
This is what Judith Butler calls responsibilization.
Exactly. The imperative to recycle or to address climate change is pushed onto the individual. Campbell Jones called it the subject supposed to recycle. The structure itself, the global supply chains, the fossil fuel companies, they all recede into invisibility.
Fisher suggests a provocative way out of this trap. He says instead of saying everyone is responsible,
It would be better to say no one is, and that's the problem.
because the cause is an impersonal, hyper-complex, structured global capital which isn't capable of exercising moral responsibility.
The required subject, a collective political subject capable of structural change, it just doesn't exist yet. And until it's constructed, the crisis demands that we confront the idea that the problem is not individual ethics, but the structure itself that disallows collective action.
Finally, we see why alternatives are so quickly dismissed. They often fall into this nostalgia trap. They feel old before they're even created.
Fisher points out this profound paradox of our time. We have an unparalleled rate of change, coupled with an unparalleled standardization of everything. And this results in a pervasive nostalgia, a culture incapable of generating authentic novelty.
Just constant reverting to familiar cultural forms, reboots, and sequels.
The endless superhero movies, the Bourne films, even memento films about memory disorders mirroring a cultural failure to look forward. The ultimate postmodern impasse is the inability to make new memories or to generate new political visions.
And Adam Curtis observed that this reliance on the familiar is driven by fear, which breeds conformity.
Late capitalism is dominated by fear and cynicism, which breed the cult of the minimal variation. Innovation is less likely now because the risk of failure is too great. This is why innovation was sometimes more likely in the supposedly stodgy, centralized culture of the post-war consensus.
Like the BBC Radiophonic Workshop.
That's a wonderful example. That workshop, funded by the public service-oriented BBC, could embed sonic experimentalism into everyday TV and radio because it didn't have to worry about immediate commercial returns. Those kinds of risks are unthinkable now that the public has been displaced by the consumer.
The system is designed to generate commodities that are immensely popular.
Yet leave people deeply unsatisfied. The most powerful forms of desire are cravings for the strange, the unexpected, the genuinely new. Fisher even suggests a new austerity might be necessary, not for ethical reasons, but to quicken desire. In a culture where unlimited license leads to a miserable depressive hedonia, laying down limitations on consumption and stimulation might paradoxically be the key to genuine novelty.
So what Fisher helps us see is that invisible barrier, that horizon of the thinkable constraining our thought and action. He reveals that the vices are engendered by the structure, not by pathological individuals.
It helps us recognize the corrosive nature of market Stalinism and the deep privatization of psychological distress.
The struggle, therefore, must be waged on the terrain of imagination itself.
We need to convert widespread mental health problems from medicalized conditions into effective antagonisms, channeling that deep disaffection toward its real cause, capital. Imagination itself becomes political in the task of transforming the taken for granted into the up for grabs.
The good news, I suppose, is that the 2008 crisis, while it didn't end capitalism, it did discredit neoliberalism. It scattered a political landscape littered with ideological rubble.
And that space is now cleared for a new anti-capitalism to emerge, one that isn't necessarily tied to old language or traditions. The ultimate speculative challenge isn't just to take over the state, but to develop strategies against capital's ubiquity and subordinate the state to a new, modernized general will.
It involves reviving the very concept of a public space and a collective subject that isn't reducible to just an aggregation of individual consuming interests. And that leads to a final, provocative thought for you to consider.
The very oppressiveness and totalizing nature of capitalist realism mean that even small glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities can have a disproportionately great effect. Because the system is so fragile, so built on a foundation of cynicism and disavowal, from a situation in which nothing seems possible, suddenly anything is possible again.
Our deep dive today was centered on the influential book, Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative? By Mark Fisher. We highly encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author or publisher, or check your local library. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.